Danielle vs. Silver and Rhea. Danielle vs. Daisy and Stella. Danielle vs. Priscilla and Negi. Danielle vs. Shadow and Raza. Danielle vs. Mario and Rouge. Danielle vs. Tails and Leslie. Danielle vs. Daisy and Matt. Danielle vs. Wario and Rebecca. Danielle vs. Naluigi and Mariana. Danielle vs. Luigi and Zoe. Danielle vs. Rosalina and Lucy. Danielle vs. Samario and Isabel. Danielle vs. Sunny and Yashi. Danielle vs. Steve and Mario. Danielle vs. Sonic and Izura. Danielle vs. Izzy and Sally. Danielle vs. Hyde and Libby. Danielle vs. Waluigi and Dasui. Danielle vs. Emmy and Sogi. Danielle vs. Rosie and Sonny. Danielle vs. Dilver and Blig. Danielle vs. Nick and Sunny. Danielle vs. Jesse and Razalina. Danielle vs. Nario and Luigi. Danielle vs. Dario and Natsui. Danielle vs. Blade and Lisa. Danielle vs. Tori and Blob. Danielle vs. Sonic and Mozilla. Danielle vs. Rosina and Somic. Danielle vs. Saluigi and Rushina. Danielle vs. Lario and Monica. Danielle vs. Amy and Rugi. Danielle vs. Desi and Nogi. Danielle vs. Hatsune and Nonik. Danielle vs. Sonics and Rosanna. Danielle vs. Peach and Rogi. Danielle vs. Sage and Tonic. Danielle vs. Blaze and Simon. Danielle vs. Maria Luigi and Lizzie. Danielle vs. Tailsy and Mike. Danielle vs. Knuckles and Shanta. Danielle vs. Madonna and Yoshi. Danielle vs. Megana and Nazi. Danielle vs. Nancy and Duario. Danielle vs. Rogue and Demario. Danielle vs. Luigi's and Foxy. Danielle vs. Muigi and Hazy. Danielle vs. Mochi and Izagi. Danielle vs. Nate and Suania. Danielle vs. Shidu and Nightshade. Danielle vs. Rosana and Kafji. Danielle vs. Brianna and Issei. Danielle vs. Megi and Ichiro. Danielle vs. Iggy and Nanami. Danielle vs. Sayaoki and Giovanni. Danielle vs. Lucina and Razzie. Danielle vs. Bernadette and Sugio. Danielle vs. Maisie and Raditz. Danielle vs. Shaggy and Roxanne. Danielle vs. Ashley and Saxio.